right, we're looking at irreducible complexity, which somebody left a comment on the fact that it was more in favor of evolution than creationism. As a matter of fact, it's the death knell of creationism and an intelligent designer. And we're looking at his commentaries on this, and I'm answering it point for point. This particular author is talking about, as an example, one might consider the question of how left-to-right asymmetry arises in vertebrate development, a question that was beyond explanation until the 1990s. In 1990, one might have argued that the body's left-right asymmetry could just as well be explained by the intervention of a designer as by an unknown molecular mechanism. Only a decade later, the actual molecular mechanism was identified, and any claim one might have made for the intervention of a designer would have been discarded. The same point can be made, of course, regarding any structure or mechanism whose origins are not yet understood. So I guess the point is, although we don't yet know, we know that we can refute it. That's like, how many years between the fossils? Well, it's in the space between the fossils. We just tell you what it says, but we don't have any evidence to that effect. But my point is, this does not rule out an intelligent designer, does it really? Were you there to observe, repeat, and falsify? No. Who created the molecular mechanism, since you did not stipulate that it evolved? Oh, that's right. You haven't a clue how it did evolve, if it did at all, because you're answering from a point of we don't know yet. Besides that, just because you believe something doesn't make that belief true. So you don't believe in an intelligent designer, that doesn't make it true or false. The facts do. The earth was never flat, despite so many who believe that it was. What do you believe? And what you do believe, and many even operate on, you may find out was never true. Only future circumstances will tell. Can you think of the things you believed in as a child that did not prove to be true? Is there a supernatural Santa in your past, and now you don't believe it anymore? Well, evidence shows that there isn't a supernatural Santa, but you have to wait to see the evidence, not go along with what you were told to believe. Now, the author goes on, his name is Miller. The utility of the bacterial flagellum is that it seems to rise above the argument from ignorance. By asserting that it is a structure in which the removal of an element would cause the whole system to cease functioning, then the flagellum is presented as a molecular machine whose individual parts must have been specifically crafted to work as an ununified assembly. The existence of such a multi-part machine, therefore, provides genuine scientific proof of the actions of an intelligent designer. That's what he's quoting. Now, the question here is, has anybody tested this scientifically? Or has anyone limited themselves to just what they believed? I don't read of any evidence that this guy, that Miller, took away of the elements from an active bacteria to see if it would still work. You tear it apart, see how it works. The idea of going to another species with a similar design of flagellum, but which does not have the same precise components of the first species, and comparing them is bad science, especially if it has a different function. Each species has its own design, albeit some species might have a similar design but not the same design, hence comparison is not legitimate. Compare apples with apples, oranges with oranges. In the case of the flagellum, Miller says the assertion of irreducible complexity means that a minimum number of protein components, perhaps 30, are required to produce a working biological function. By the logic of irreducible complexity, these individual components should have no function until all 30 are put into place, at which point the function of motility appears. Yes, the implication is within the same species. Did you do this test? You can have different functions in different places with different material or less material. In the case here, he's bringing up another bacterium, used similar components, but not all of them, and it was able to secrete toxins. Well, that's not comparing apples with apples. But what he says is, what this means, of course, is that evolution could not have fashioned those components at a few at a time, since they do not have functions that could be favored by natural selection. Again, it's within the same species did you do this test. Not looking around for something that's similar, but something that's the same, that you can compare apples with apples. As Behe wrote, natural selection can only choose among systems that are already working, and an irreducibly complex system does not work unless all of its parts are in place in that species. The flagellum is irreducibly complex, and therefore it must have been designed. He says, case closed. And so far, the case is closed because no one has bothered to take that particular species with that particular motorizing component and reduce the number of components in there to see whether it would continue to work. So for that particular species is obviously implied. Apples and apples. Answering the argument. Well, now Miller goes and answers. The assertion that cellular machines are irreducibly complex and therefore provide proof of design is not going unnoticed by the scientific community. A number of detailed rebuttals have appeared in the literature, and many have pointed out the poor reasoning of recasting the classic argument from design in the modern language of biochemistry, which are these are four examples. I've suggested, he says, elsewhere that the scientific literature contains counterexamples to any assertion that evolution cannot explain biochemical complexity. But you have to do it comparing apples with apples, and you're not doing that so far. And other workers have addressed the issue of how evolutionary mechanisms allow biological systems to increase in information content. The most powerful rebuttals to the flagellum story, however, have not come from direct attempts to answer the critics of evolution. However, they have emerged from the steady progress of scientific work on the genes and proteins associated with the flagellum and other cellular structures, by trying to observe similar construction, similar ideas with a different species. That's not apples and apples. Such studies have now established that the entire premise by which this molecular machine has been advanced as an argument against evolution is wrong. The bacterial flagellum is not irreducibly complex. So far, it is. You've just shown something similar to that bacterial flagellum that works on locomotion, and you say, well, it works with fewer components over here for secreting toxins. It's not the same thing. Apples and apples, not apples and oranges. So far within the same species, i.e., I say, within this particular bacterial flagellum, it appears to work properly only when all the observable parts are in place. You haven't taken apart the parts. Take one at a time, see how it works. That is after all the implication. It's not implied that you can go around looking for something similar and say, well, this doesn't work the same way. Well, it doesn't work the same way. It's in a different species. We are not comparing apples and oranges or even Macintosh apples with green apples, are we? Well, he goes on to say, as we will see, the flagellum, the supreme example of the power of this new science and design, has failed its most basic scientific test. No, it hasn't. It hasn't been tested. Remember, the claim that any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. In the same species until you show that it does function. Wow. Within the same species. What part of that don't you get? Am I repeating myself here? Yeah. Take a human being with a complete, effectively working blood clotting system and compare it with another human being, notice the same species, who has hemophilia, which indicates a defective blood clotting system, i.e. all the components are not in the proper functioning capacity. Now you have a problem with irreducible complexity because not all of the components are functioning properly. See? So it probably has to be put in working order all at once by an intelligent designer, and if you have hemophilia, you're going to have something that's not adequate. This might be attributable to a bad stage of evolution or to the decision of an intelligent designer who, because of his judgment upon sinful man, he does design a component blood clotting system, but leaves improper functioning components there. And that's the biblical intelligent designer. We're not perfect anymore. On the other hand, you cannot compare the blood clotting system of a human being with that of a dolphin, as this author has done in this article. Dolphins are not the same as humans. They have a different environment they live in, and thereby declare something conclusive because the species dolphin is quite different from the species humankind, sufficient to make the comparison inadequate to conclude that evolution is in view or an intelligent designer is in view. Well, if the dolphin has a blood clotting system that's identical to a human and it works, or it doesn't have one that is identical but it still works, you haven't concluded anything. You've just made a false comparison. As evidence has shown, nature is filled with examples of precursors to the flagellum that are indeed missing a part and yet are fully functional, but not in the same species, you've proved. You're just looking at and observing a different species and saying, well, it does this emptying toxins into its environment, but it's not doing locomotion, and it's not the same species, apples and oranges. Not proved because the system in one species might be different from a system in another and still function and thereby not be interchangeable. Have you actually tested your hypotheses by taking out a part and replacing it with a less complex part that appears to be of similar design, less a few components, and then observing if the species still performs as it did? And the answer is no. This is basic science. Functional enough, in some cases, to pose a serious threat to human life by doing something different, putting toxins out there in a human's environment. But evidently not in that particular species. The point is that within that particular species that you have observed with the more complex system of locomotion, you have not observed to have the less complex system from another series that provides a toxic delivery system. Instead, that's an entirely different function in an entirely different species. So you do not know if the bacteria would actually function properly or not, having not actually tested it in real life. You're just guessing. Also, the toxic bacteria might not function with the more complex system of locomotion either. You're just guessing again. Perhaps the missing component observed in the first bacteria was required for some function in the first species that was not observed functioning via your investigation, hence viewed by you as not required in the second species that did not have that part. Who's on first? What's on second? In any case, getting all those parts together in that first species in the manner in which they were observed presents a problem to do that over time and yet have that species function the way it was observed functioning. It nevertheless is irreducibly complex until proved otherwise and demands an intelligent designer relative to at least that one species, but the scope of your investigation may not be applicable to all species. But if there is an intelligent designer, it stands to reason that being that intelligent, he is creator of all species in a short, convenient, and amazing period of time. So, given a choice, if you can do one or the other, I think I'll take the intelligent designer. He seems to care for life a little bit more than this cold-hearted, multifaceted, long-term evolution. There's no death with the intelligent designer once he comes back and fixes the world and humanity. That's biblical. Well, we got the type 3 secretory apparatus. In the popular imagination, bacteria are germs, tiny microscopic bugs that make us sick. Microbiologists smile at the generalization, knowing that most bacteria are perfectly benign, and many are beneficial, even essential to human life. I don't understand why he's making this argument. Nonetheless, there's some people can be in favor of an intelligent designer and a scientist, or not. There are indeed bacteria that produce diseases, ranging from the mildly unpleasant to the truly dangerous. Pathogenic or disease-causing bacteria threatens the organisms they infect in a variety of ways, one of which is to produce poisons and inject them directly into the cells of the body. Once again, these toxins break down and destroy the host cells, producing illness, tissue damage, and sometimes even death. So in order to carry out this diabolical work, bacteria must not only produce the protein toxins that bring about the demise of their hosts, but they must efficiently inject them across the cell membranes and into the cells of their hosts. They do this by means of any number of specialized protein secretory systems. One known as the type 3 secretory system, TTSS, allows gram-negative bacteria to translocate proteins directly into the cytoplasm of a cell. We'll talk about this next time.